Okay, so First Samuel chapter 8, and we've got this kind of designated in the scriptures there, that grouping. That's how we'll read them and make some observations other than what we have written down there. Of course, when you think about Samuel, it literally is the name of Samuel, who was the last of the judges. The judge period started, of course, if you go back to the book of Judges, and there was a list of judges. You get about midway, you've got Samson was one of the judges. You've got Gideon, different ones. But Samuel's going to be the last of what we call the judges. So he's kind of falls between the judge time period and the king time period. And so we're going to look at the actual official request for the nation to have a king. We're going to see what God thought of that and some things that'll help us with what we find here, okay? So notice 1 Samuel 8, verses 1 through 3. It says this, "And it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre," that'd be after money, "and took bribes and perverted judgment." So we're going to stop right there for now. All right, so notice what I have here, and I think this kind of jumped out at me. I don't know about you, but if you are familiar with the judges' time period, it almost seems like every one of those judges, God spoke to them, moved them, and they became a judge. That was almost always in conjunction with Israel was in a situation in which they were under persecution, oppression from foreign foes and the neighboring people that come in and rob them of this, rob them of that, and put them under bondage almost to that extent. And it was almost always in conjunction with Israel kind of drifted from God. And then God allowed these people to come in there and do what they did. And then they'd cry out to God, and God would send them a deliverer, okay? And almost the book of Judges is exclusively about these judges being raised up, that God moved them rather than, people selected them. So I think what's interesting here, when you notice here in verse number 1, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. In other words, he selected them to be the judges. I can't see where that was wrong for him to do that, but I do know this. Sometimes you find in the Bible when God was not consulted, that certainly wasn't the right decision. And as good as Samuel was, it almost seems like he was trying to say, for this to carry on properly, I guess, I need to have some people in line, and I guess my sons would be as good as any. But when you notice here from the description of his sons, the Bible says in verse 3, they walked not in his ways. Samuel was one of the great giants of the faith, great in his character, but the Bible said his sons, they turned after money and took bribes and perverted judgment. So that being said, they were given what we would call a very high position. And we know this, the sad thing is positions don't make people. A high position like that often reflects your character. In other words, sometimes we go through things and it reveals really who we are. And I think sometimes God puts us through things and say, you know what, you do need me. Or there are some things you need to get in your life because here's the pressure and here's some things you need to be aware of. So obviously these were not going to be good judges if in fact they became judges after Samuel's death, all right? You can look later at Exodus 18:21. I have that there, but it basically said back in Moses' day that you need to find people that were not covetous people. In other words, don't find people that already have a tendency to want things and to be, basically greedy, if you please. It's find people that's not that way, because if you don't, then what's going to happen is you put them in a position, number one, they're going to take advantage of other people and they're going to take from people. All governments of all times, including the one that we live in now, when you put people in office that have bad character, they will take advantage of that position and they will make sure that their pockets get lined very well and they'll use it to their advantage. There's no doubt about that. And that was basically his son's lots. And really, you don't hear much about them after this. It's like they were not significant in any way or not. Now notice verses 4 and 5. It says, Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old. So they noticed he would not be around that long. And thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And I have underlined from the word make a king to judge us like, and I have circled all the nations. Now, I think most of you understand what's being said here. The first thing you must realize is that it's sad that the sons of Samuel did not have the proper character. Whether or not there was going to be a judge or not after Samuel's demise, we know, of course, it didn't work out that way. It's just sad whether or not you have a position. You should always be in a position morally, character-wise, and spiritually-wise that God could put you in any position and you would not exempt yourself because if you've got something about your life that's just not right. And I think that was an indictment, not against Samuel, because I think Samuel probably did everything he could. As a matter of fact, if you go all the way back to the first part of Samuel, when Samuel was that little boy and Eli was raising him, and Hannah lent him to the Lord, Eli did not correct his sons. And God says, those two boys of yours, they're going to die one day, and it's going to be the judgment of God. And it says part of the judgment is because you wouldn't restrain them. You allowed them to be perverts. They were perverts. They were priests. They had a position, really in a sense, greater than a judge. And they took advantage, and they took care of themselves. And so if anybody knew about looking at Eli, and even I think from a young man's standpoint, I think Samuel looked and said, this is the wrong example. Eli, he's here, but he didn't restrain his sons and do what he should have done, and everybody knew how bad that was. So I think when Samuel had his sons, I don't think Samuel would have said, I don't care about my sons. I think he says, I want you boys to be right for right's sake, but you're going to be judges one day. So the point here is, it was sad that these boys could not, from a character standpoint, really be a judge. The second thing is, of course, and this is the big one here, is that the people either used it as an excuse and said, because of that, you're going to die. Your sons are not worthy to rule and to judge us. We want a king. Now, if it had only been about that, it still wouldn't have been proper, because there's a God in heaven that always took care of his people, always put the right leadership into position. But it's interesting here that they made the little statement, though, that I have circled here, and this really is what makes the difference. Like all the nations. In other words, we want to be like the world. We want to be like the world around us. We don't want to be like we are now, like we've been all this time. Whether or not it would have deterred the people from requesting a king, if Samuel's sons had been perfect in character, it is still sad that the people had no confidence in Samuel's sons because of their character. But being like all the nations is never an excuse to not follow God's pattern. Never an excuse. When we look at the world and we want to be like the world, God says you should never be like the world. You're my people. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. That's strong language, but you know what? That's the truth. And that's coming from a book from 1 John that really centers on this idea of really testing yourself and testing others, those who love not the brethren. Don't say you love God and you hate the brethren. God says that, use an old-fashioned term, that dog don't hunt. God says you say things, and when you say things that's contrary to God, the Bible and that language says you've made him a liar. And God is no liar, we know that. So the point here is that they can excuse and say, you know what, your sons are not worthy, but you know what, there's still a God in heaven that could have given them another Samuel. That wouldn't have been the problem. The problem is their heart was already not right. And they used that as an excuse to say, we want a king, by the way. We want to be like everybody else. It's never right to be like the world, never, never, never. Now notice verses 6 through 8 as this kind of starts to unravel here. But the thing displeased to Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people, and all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. You know what? When I look at the Bible, it'd be one thing for a preacher to kind of read between the lines, but when you see something that emphatic, here's God that says, for the most part, the heart of this people, ever since they left Egypt, all the way to this point that they've requested a king, he says their heart hasn't been right. They forsook me. They've had other gods in their heart. There's a reason why they went through that 400-plus year period in which judges had to be raised up, because what they did, they says, look, we're in a tough situation now. But you know what put them in that situation? Their ungodliness, their idolatry. They're departing from God. And God says, okay, I'm going to let these people have their way with you for a while. And because God is compassionate and because God says, you are my people, I'll raise you up a judge. And they were okay for a while. Then what happens? They go right back in that same little path. And God says, this has been a pattern ever since they left Egypt, he said. And he says, look, he says, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They've rejected me. Samuel brings the matter before the Lord, which is what we should always do in situations. Too many times I think we find ourselves going last to God instead of going first to God. And Samuel says, I'm going to pray about this. I've heard what they've said. But rejection of the godly is the reaction to the rejection of God. In other words, I could see where Samuel say, well, you know, you're rejecting me. You're rejecting my counsel. They knew he would have been displeased with that, I'm sure. But who they were displeased with was God. And when you serve God, people that really have a beef with God one way or the other, lost and even saved people, they'll take it out on God's people. They'll take it out especially on God's leader. You know why? Because if you look through the Bible, that's what they do. Jeremiah was treated that way. You can go through and list a bunch of them. But the point is, that's where it all lies. It's really what we think and our love or lack of love for God. So God was telling me, he says, this is the way this is, and don't you take it personal. Now notice verses 9 through 17. He says, here's what they're going to get when they get a king instead of me. Now therefore hearken unto their voice. He has said that I think at least twice already, that he's saying, look, we're going to do what they want. He says, you go ahead and listen to them, because God already knew that with their heart the way it was. He says, I'm going to give them what they're going to ask for then. But notice what he says here. Howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them. In other words, you tell them it's not a great idea here, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, this will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots. In other words, he's going to put them all in his army. And he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over 50s. And he will set them to ear his ground. So that means the king, whatever property that he has, you know that's not going to be just his little thing. He'll say, I'm the king, and I can acquire property because I'm the king. He says that's what he's going to do. And what you're going to do is you're going to farm that land for him, is what he's saying. And to reap his harvest. And to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. So in other words, he says he's going to take all these people, he's going to build a massive kingdom, and they're going to have all these positions. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. Does that not sound like government for you right there? I mean, good night. I mean, this is about as plain as a nose literally on your face. God says, here's what's going to happen when you get this king. He's going to put all these people in his army, and he's going to build some massive kingdom. There's going to be bakers and all these kind of people, and he's going to take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards. And he says, you know what? I'm going to take them from you, the people, and I'm going to give them to my people. And that'll be kind of their gifts for working for the king, so to speak. All right? Then he says in verse 16, he will take your men servants and your maidservants and your goodliest young men and your asses and put them to work, to his work. He will, now notice this in verse 17, he will take the 10th of your sheep and ye shall be his servants. Now I want you to notice something, verse 17 and verse 15. He's going to take the 10th of your seed and he's going to take the 10th of your sheep. Where have you ever heard this 10th idea before? Don't it sound like tithing? It sounds like the king's got this idea. He says, you know what, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll kind of do what God does. God says, and by the way, it all belongs to God. But the king says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take the 10th of your seed, and I'm going to take the 10th there of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. He says, that's what you're going to expect out of a king, because that's what the kings of the world do. That's what they do. All right, so that speaks for itself. He says, I want you to make sure they understand that. And that wasn't spoken in a positive tone. That was spoken to warn the people, you're not going to get what you think you're going to get. And notice verse 18, and ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. Isaiah 1:15, you can turn that later. But I tell you what, there's when I look at this and I thought about this, and I know we have a God and I know he hears and answers prayer, but the Bible says right there that when these kings, there'll be multiple kings obviously down through the period of the kings, and the nation will be divided, but they'll both have kings and kings. Some will be worse than others, but at the end of the day, these kings take things from the people and they acquire these things. They are the king, you see. And God says, one of these days you're going to cry out and say, it's not working out good for us. This king is oppressing us. You know what God says? I'm not going to hear you when you do that. Now I thought about that and I thought, you know what? I realize as children of God that we can get out of sorts with God. There's things we can do. We've all known people, and there may have been a period in your life where you got out of the will of God. People do this. And some people get real far out of the will of God. Some come back and some don't. But we think about this in terms, we think about if a man left the church and went out here and he started he became an alcoholic and he was drinking and he wasn't doing right. Let's say a man goes out, leaves the will of God, he commits adultery. People that do things. But you know, when I look here in the Bible, it's almost like God says, but I will specifically not hear your prayer when you turn against me. Samuel, you're not the issue. They don't want me. They've rejected me. And all I'm saying is this, it's a warning to me, it's a warning to everybody here, okay? Now we need to listen to this. These are his people. These are his people. By the way, Samuel was a man, if anybody had the proper spiritual atmosphere around these people, Samuel was that man. There's no doubt about it. But they were rejecting that, and they wanted a king. And God says, you're going to cry out one day to me, and I'm not going to listen to you because you chose your king instead of choosing me. So here's a warning for me right on down here. Be very, very careful the decisions you make that especially are based upon the fact that it's something against God. And you say, well, every sin's against God. Yeah, a man can commit murder, we could steal, we could do all these things. But let's just put it this way. When a person decides, I don't want to be around God or his people for little seasons, I don't want to read my Bible like I should, you know who that really is against? It's against God and him only. How sad it is if we live a life like that and all of a sudden we find ourselves in a position where we want to call out to God. Now I know God is merciful and I know God has reached down to people, but I'm going to tell you something. God said these people are going to do this one day, and he says, and I'm not going to hear them. Here's what I'm saying. You don't ever want to get yourself in a position where you have done things against God. I'm not talking about murder. I'm talking about just being nonchalant with God. Let's be real frank here. We're talking about people that don't want to attend the house of God when the services are here. Because you'd rather be like the world instead of being where God's people are. Now listen to me, because this is where people live. I, as your preacher, I'm going to get the phone call one day, and I want to help people. But I'm going to tell you something. I don't just get phone calls from people that sit on the pews here regularly, and we pray for you, we help you. You get calls from people that's out of the will of God, and they want God to jump in there. But they made their decision to say, God, you know what, I'm going to distance myself, and I know you're my God and all of that, but, and they've got their king, so to speak. And by the way, the world will never, ever be your friend. Never, never. The world will use you, and they'll use you, and when you don't have anything else to give back to them, you'll be dropped, and you'll be saying, God, I need help. So I'm saying that this was something against God and Him only. They didn't go out here and murder people. They said to God, we want a king, we want a king. And God says, I'm not going to listen to them on that day. Now, I know there's times where God says, okay, it's going to be like that, and then God says, okay, enough. I'm going to come back in here, and I'm going to bail you out. I'm going to help you. But the best thing to do is to stay close to God as you possibly can. And watch this idea of the world. You know what? There's a lot of churches, they want to be like the world. They want to be like the world. They enjoy that. That's their thing. But I'm going to tell you something, that never works. That never works. And boy, did they have a great spiritual giant in Samuel. All right, now notice verse 18 here. All right, we've read that. Okay, look at verse 19 through 22 and we're finished. We just have 4 more verses, I think it is. It says, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, nay, but we will have a king over us. So he basically preached them a little sermon here, and they said, no, that's okay. We're good, thank you, though. But they heard it. And then they said, nay, but we will have a king over us. Notice this in verse 20, that we also may be like all the nations. So that was their heartbeat there. They wanted to be like the nations. They had a heart for the world and not a heart for God. It's always a dangerous thing. I know we live in the world, but it is very possible to be very close to God and live in this world. And you tell the world, you are my temporary home. But my God, I love Him. And God has done everything He's done for us. Look, we just literally celebrated Easter Sunday. I hope that's not one day where we do all of that and we play around on Easter, and then the rest of the time we wait to the very next holiday. Maybe we get a little bit moved by that. I'm going to tell you something. God wants our heart. Did not He say, I want you to love me with everything you've got? Did He not say, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world? Now, it's possible to be very close to God. And here's what they were saying in verse 20. We want to be like the nations. We don't like to be different. Now, I'm like you. I don't necessarily enjoy the fact that I can go out here in this community and some people would not have anything to do with me just because I have the title of preacher and especially the title of a Baptist preacher. They don't have to know anything about me. They can just say, oh, okay, thank you very much. I know what that's like. I've lived that, and this is not poo-poo on me. That's just a fact. You tell people you're a Christian and you live the Christian life, you will not have the world applauding you. I'll tell you that. They will distance themselves very quickly from you. Being like the other nations, they said. Now notice this, that our king may judge us. In other words, we want a king to make the decisions over us. Well, based on the fact of what God told Samuel what a king would be like, what they were saying is, we trust the judgment of the king over God, is what they're saying. In other words, he'll be easy on us. You know, there are people that think this is a hard church to attend. You know why? Because your preacher stands up and preaches the Bible. Well, I don't want that hard stuff. What is hard stuff? You mean running from what God has said? See, the way of the transgressor is hard. But the devil lies to people. And he lies to them and says, oh, you know, he's tough. God's too hard. Be like the other nations. Well, we want a king to judge us, and here's one of the worst ones here, and go out before us and fight our battles. Oh, so we don't want God fighting our battles anymore. So in other words, what God did in Egypt, there's no man that could have ever done what was done in Egypt. There's not all the armies of the world couldn't part a sea and let a people pass through a sea. There's not a man in this world that can bring food down from heaven for 40 years. There's not a man in this world that can do the things that God has done, and yet they said, you know what, we want, and by the way, the battles, You know, we do know that when you think about the time period of the Bible, Joshua was the great leader, and they conquered most of the land because God said, here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to give you this land, it's your land, and I'm going to fight either your battles for you or I will be with you in the battle, but God made the difference. How about when they said, you know what, we want a king to fight our battles? Let me tell you something, a king alone, they wouldn't get very far, would they? And by the way, that's part of the problem. It's our problem is when we think we can do it or someone else can do it and God can't do it. So that's what they were saying. Verse 21, and Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. How do you think that went? Now, you know the Lord already heard it, but here's Samuel coming back in prayer. So I'm going to tell you what they told me. Verse 22, and the Lord said to Samuel, hearken unto their voice. He kept saying, go ahead and listen to them, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, go ye every man into a city. Now, I'm not going to start a series here, but you know the first king is going to be Saul. But I'll say this, that when you read this, the thing about Saul was, I know he went bad. But he wasn't bad to start with. He was the best of the land. Here's the thing. Here's what messes up people, in my opinion. When you try to take a system that's faulty, and you can take the best and put it in a faulty system, man, it will destroy. It will really, it's like a rottenness that goes through it. Saul made his decisions, and they were his. He had to own up to them. Yes, he did. But you know what? When he was approached, you're going to be the king, Saul was a very humble man. And on the day they was going to bring him to the coronation, they could not find him. He was hiding. He didn't want to be a king. That wasn't his thing. He was a good man, but he got put in that position. You say, well, who chose him? God did choose him. It's almost like God was saying, I'm going to put the best one in there of you, and let me show you what you've done really to Saul in a sense. Now, Saul made his decisions, and he had to live by that. He had to own those. But you know what? It is pretty bad that when you take a man like Saul who was satisfied with God being God, him being the king, and Samuel and all the way this thing was set up, suddenly he becomes the king. And again, the position didn't make him bad, but I'm going to tell you something. In a sense, though, I think those people, there's some responsibility. They should have never asked. You ever been somewhere you shouldn't have been, and things just happen? Well, Saul was chosen to be king because the people says we want him, and God says, I'm going to show you. And the sad thing is, I know Saul made his decisions, but he was a good man. Had he not been in that position, maybe Saul would have lived the rest of his life a very, very goodly person, as the Bible says he started out. So I guess the lessons are, and this is kind of heavy stuff, I know that, but when we love the Lord, this is not difficult. We can take this. I know we can take this tonight because good godly people look at us and go, oh Lord, you know, I want to make sure I don't have that kind of mindset. And by the way, the fact you're sitting here on the church pews, that would add to that. But don't ever let anybody, the world or anybody, make you feel inferior to them or anybody because you decide that you're going to come to church and you're going to be faithful to the house of God, you're going to live right. Because I'm going to tell you something, that's a poor way of trying to make people feel bad because there's some people think this is a waste of time to come here on a Sunday night, Wednesday night. It's not a waste of time. God said when you meet, you come out here. And it shows a love for God and a love for God's people. And I believe when we meet with each other, there's that, you know what it is. So what I'm saying is how sad the people chose a king instead of God. Let's all be careful. Let's all be careful when we make choices that's so selfish and so really blind in a way that we think we can take in all the world takes in and say, that's what I want. And I don't have to do this. I don't have to have God calling all the shots. Tell you what, yeah, we do.